Hello. Have you ever noticed yourself holding in your tears till you're alone? Do you sometimes cry and not understand why? Are you asking yourself, why do all of my examples have to do with crying? Well, that one probably has more to do with my own childhood trauma. But my point is that we as humans are constantly experiencing emotions, and we rarely understand them. So I started to think about this, and I reasoned that there are two things that influence our behavior: nature and nurture. Nature is any inherent natural ability or behavior, such as the ability to find food or fight for survival. Nurture, on the other hand, is any behavior that comes about as a result of childhood experiences or rearing. Things like saying please or learning how not to eat with your elbows on the table. But then the question became, so which affects our behavior more, nature or nurture? Well, after doing some research, I found that the answer is both. Hold on. It's both? Yes. Listen, emotions are, by their very nature, extremely personal. This means that the emotional behavior and where it comes from differs from person to person. Everyone has certain chemicals that naturally occur in our brains, and these chemicals trigger certain behaviors and emotions. But for some, these chemicals are more potent than for others. On the other hand, much of our behavior is a reflection of the way that we were raised, and sometimes this can affect certain people more than others. Let me explain. We'll start with the natural chemical processes that occur in every human, focusing on the 4 chemicals that trigger emotional responses. The first 3 are sometimes referred to as feel-good hormones and consist of serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. Serotonin is the mood regulator hormone, and it can generate a calm and focused mood. Dopamine is the original feel-good hormone and is most commonly associated with our understandings of happiness. It creates a sense of pleasure in the body and is used as the body's natural reward. It's the chemical that triggers feelings of happiness when we eat our favorite foods or do other things we enjoy. Now, oxytocin is referred to as the love hormone and is naturally released in situations that can lead to the continuation of the species, such as sex, childbirth, etc. There are even some indicators that oxytocin can promote trust and empathy in relationships, but this aspect of its nature isn't quite understood yet. The other common hormone that isn't part of the feel-good trio is adrenaline. Adrenaline is what triggers our fight or flight response and is released in potentially threatening situations. It is the key to the survival of the body, at least in the most basic caveman person terms it is. Some people even enjoy the feelings of an adrenaline rush and deliberately seek out dangerous activities to trigger them. These 4 chemicals exist in every human from birth. And as I've said, some chemicals are more potent in certain people than in others. But as we grow, we learn to regulate and tamper our reactions to these chemicals through something called the frontal lobe. So a child's brain develops, in the most uncomplicated terms, from back to front, starting with the cerebellum, the occipital lobe, and then the parietal lobe. All of these perform basic functions, like motor skills or vision. But the last part of the brain to develop and be wired in is the frontal lobe. This is the brain's regulator, the emotional filter, the conscience. Because it is the last to develop, the frontal lobe is not fully active until we are teenagers and young adults. This is why toddlers will throw a temper tantrum when they don't get their way. Their emotional regulator isn't wired in yet. But by the time we are adults, the frontal lobe is fully formed and has absorbed enough of the world around us to know when and how to filter our responses. So consciously or not, we are basically screening our behavior at every moment. What complicates the matter of nature versus nurture is that the frontal lobe learns how to regulate from its environment. A child learns not to use violence to get their way by someone telling them no. So then the next time that the child wants to hit someone just because they can, they will hopefully remember that it got them in trouble, and they'll regulate themselves by not punching Susie just to get a hold of her color-changing mermaid Barbie. So, if we are constantly filtering our emotions through the frontal lobe, we now have to understand that our conscience and regulatory behaviors are heavily influenced by our childhood experiences and environment. There are many ways to look at this, and different childhood experiences can greatly affect how we act. Now, there are thousands of studies that focused on the many aspects of development, but one study I found looked at children who grew up in the co-parenting environment and how that affected their parenting behavior later in life. For those that don't know, co-parenting is often used to describe a family situation where the parents aren't married and instead split time with their kids often between two households. The most common example of this is divorce. This study focused on this dynamic in Italian families and found that parents' failures in emotional regulation and stress management transferred to their kids, and it affected them later in life. Essentially, these kids were negatively affected by their parents' inability to separate their stress and emotions from their interactions with their kids. So when the children became adults, they also didn't know how to regulate their emotions, and that negatively impacted their kids, and so the cycle continued. This sort of behavior can be seen on much smaller scales in most family homes. We can all probably remember a time when a parent came home stressed from work and was short with us as children. Or perhaps you are a parent and know that when you're personally insulted, your emotions can cloud your judgment and your normal patience with your kids may disappear. This is a problem because children have very few inherent coping mechanisms, but the most common one is self-blame. A child who is never taught otherwise will internalize all parental reprimands/outbursts as their own fault. In their respective TED Talks, Destiny Ann Davis, author and self-proclaimed parent coach, and Dr. Becky Kennedy, clinical psychologist, shared their experiences with emotions as mothers. Destiny Ann Davis discusses emotions and how they affect children from the perspective of someone who was labeled the bad kid in childhood. She opens her TED Talk with how she carried that label through life, from bad kid to bad teen to bad adult. Then she shares an example of her own child, throwing a temper tantrum on the grocery store floor. Destiny's response was to put the same label on her child that was put on her. Destiny's daughter became the bad kid, but Destiny felt like the bad mom. Labels like this can follow us, and not just negative ones. Labels like smart or responsible can hurt a child's self-esteem just as much. This problem arises when we associate who a person is with their behaviors. Because Destiny and her child did not follow directions, their bad actions became associated with their person, and they were labeled the bad kid. Dr. Becky Kennedy echoed this problem, but she offered a solution. Dr. Kennedy also opened her TED Talk with a personal experience in which she yelled at her son. But she used this to introduce her parenting and emotional regulation strategy of repair, something she defined as, quote, the act of going back to a moment of disconnection, taking responsibility for your behavior and acknowledging the impact it had on another, end quote. Dr. Kennedy split repair into two steps. The first was self-repair. Self-repair is a separation from the labels that have followed us since childhood. It is the act of realizing that our identity, who we are, is not our behavior, what we do. This first step not only helps you understand and grow in yourself, but it shifts your energy and gives you presence of mind for step two. Step two was repairing with the other person, and the simplest way to do this was in three key parts. Quote, name what happened, take responsibility, and state what you would do differently next time. By recognizing and working towards separating ourselves from our labels, we are breaking a cycle of self-doubt and unhealthy behaviors. Now, in doing research for this topic, I had hoped to send a survey to our student body containing questions about their current emotional behavior and what they remembered and learned from childhood. I was hoping to find personal anecdotes to expand upon my own and use as examples. But on Monday, March 25th, I learned that a bill has been passed in Kansas that says no one can survey students unless the contents of the survey have been reviewed and approved by the school board in a rather lengthy process. Even the PHS Student Council has been turned down many times in their requests to send innocent surveys to students. Even so, some of you might be sitting there saying, okay, they don't want students' privacy violated by surveys. That's totally fine, right? Well, based on the reactions of bill supporters, that wasn't actually their main concern. Many parents wrote to the Kansas legislature in support of the limitations, saying that the, quote, psychological tyranny of emotional learning has, quote, no part in the Kansas curriculum. Some even claimed that emotional learning has overshadowed academics, and overall, it must stop. Now, this is just one example of a bill and the reasons behind it, but such legislation is coming up all over the country. Bills like this give small groups of parents power over a public school's curriculum, a body that is meant to educate the masses, not cater to the morals or fears of one or two parents. So what did that mean for emotions? Well, it means that most students' education on them is very limited. The problem with emotional behavior is that for most of history, it was associated with morals and left to be taught at home. However, many people don't grow up in a home environment that shows positive emotional behavior, which then leads to a lack of understanding and leaves people at a loss when dealing with emotions. In our modern civilized society, there are some basic expectations when it comes to handling one's emotions, especially if you intend to interact with other people, like at all. When we limit kids' education, we limit their future, but we can change this. We can help parents and kids understand their emotions and give them positive ways to cope with them. I'm talking about emotional regulatory skills, which can help us edit the more extreme of our behaviors. It is important to have some skills that we can pull out in situations when we're feeling overwhelmed, because if we let our stronger emotions dictate all of our actions, it could negatively affect our professional and personal relationships and leave us with a life of regrets. Unregulated emotions can also negatively affect ourselves, impairing our chances for new experiences and causing unnecessary stress or personal suffering. So, here are 4 basic regulatory skills that anyone can use. Number 1, to pause. Take a moment between the first feeling of a strong emotion and whatever response you intend to just breathe. Number 2, to tune into yourself. Be able to recognize your own natural reactions and get practice noticing your emotions. Number 3, once you notice a feeling, be able to name that reaction or emotion. This can give you a sense of control over the situation. And then, once you name it, go deeper. Ask yourself, why am I feeling this? Gain an understanding. Number 4, accept that emotion within yourself and deal with it. This can be very difficult, but we all need to realize that emotions are natural and everyone struggles with them. But not everyone deals with them in the same way, which is totally okay. Find a way that works for you. And on that note, there is no mass qualifier to tell you what is healthy and no scale to tell you what strategy will work best. Everyone's brain is different and reacts differently to different things. So here are some other strategies that you might find helpful. Some people are responsive to hypnosis, which could reassign neural pathways, altering behavior like stress eating. Other people have to start at the basics. And one of the most basic ways to regulate our emotions is to understand them. Especially for behaviors rooted in childhood, we have to take a step back and realize that this thing I do may not be the best way to interact with others, or even myself. Once you understand an emotion, you can make a conscious effort to change the behavior associated with it. For issues caused by low self-esteem, you have to acknowledge that you are not the problem. Your feelings are not the problem. The things that happen are not always caused by the things we do. And once you acknowledge this, you may find it even easier to find confidence. Honestly, the best strategy to combat most emotional problems is the repairing that I mentioned earlier. We have to learn how to separate ourselves from our labels and acknowledge that behavior can change. And on that note, if you are in need of more than basic help regulating your emotions, please seek out a trained and licensed therapist. I am not that person. I don't have that training. Finally, if your problems are chemical, there are prescription drugs that can help. As I've mentioned, our brains work differently when it comes to the natural chemical processes. And if you haven't found a strategy that works for you, and if your doctor and licensed therapist agrees, medical drugs may be part of your best solution. However, please do not go to them first, because you may have overlooked a strategy that would work just as well without the potential side effects of prescriptions. In the end, the question of whether emotional behavior is based on nature or nurture isn't easily answered. It's a complicated topic with many facets and overlapping fields. Besides that, each person is affected differently, making answers very hard to generalize. Nevertheless, if you are unhappy with your life or how your behavior is affecting your relationships, everyone can start their journey by trying to understand their emotions and behaviors as much as possible. From there, you can answer the question of nature versus nurture for yourself and find the emotional regulatory strategy that works best for you. Thank you.